Today, the NASCAR Pinty Series accompanies the NTT IndyCar Series to Toronto each July. I live near the track, so it's an event I make sure to attend each year. It's the only event on the schedule where IndyCar leaves the United States, and there's been no shortage of drama or action when the Pinty Series is involved. Along with the Grand Prix de Trois-Rivières, it's proof that NASCAR can produce incredible racing on a street course, and while getting the Cup cars today with nearly 40 entries would be a logistical challenge, it'd be fun nonetheless. But at one point in time, NASCAR did make a trek up north to the streets of Toronto. Well, kinda, sort of. I'm Stephen Ellis of CanRace, and this is the story of the NASCAR Cup Series legendary trip to the Canadian National Exhibition. Located just outside the downtown Toronto core, Exhibition Place has a reach of nearly 200 acres. With transit taking straight to the grounds, it's easily accessible for local residents and hosts over 1 million people each summer. A month after the Honda Indy, the Canadian National Exhibition Place hosts carnival rides, fast food offerings, and even a big shopping center, one where I tend to buy cheap hockey jerseys and obscure video games. Unfortunately, it was announced earlier this year that the CNE would not return for 2020 due to COVID-19, just the second time the event hasn't taken place in its 142-year history. By the 1950s, stock car racing wasn't new to Canada or Toronto specifically. Racing at Exhibition Place dates back to September 5, 1900, when the first race took place on a half-mile dirt track. According to Wheels.ca, a man named Jay Short won with an average speed of 17.85 miles an hour, or around 29 kilometers per hour, which is kind of the speed you almost see on the Gardner most of the time. The exhibition grounds was used as a showcase facility for drivers to try and set records, and there was even a race between a car and a plane in 1917. That's not a fair match, as the car won the battle. It would have helped had the plane been able to actually move freely around the track, but turns were an issue. The biggest race at Exhibition Stadium was held in April of 1952, with just under 8,000 fans braving the rain to watch Tom Forbes win the inaugural feature event. According to CanadianRacer.com, nearly 20,000 people turned out to the Canada Day event a few months later, with midget racing starting out a few days after that on July 5th. On July 31st of the same year, the first NASCAR event, a 300-lap late model race, took place. It wasn't the top division, but more so what we would consider the Xfinity Series today. Over time, more events were added to keep the action fresh and consistent. Racing wasn't allowed on Sunday afternoons in Toronto at the time, so most races took place on Friday. Of course, the grounds also played host to the Canadian National Exhibition each summer, leaving the track out of commission at times. NASCAR returned for a handful of late model races over time, with NASCAR's Convertible Series making a one-off appearance in 1956. Don Oldenburg won the event, which saw a high attrition rates with just 14 of the 21 starters making it past the 7-lap mark. And that brings us to the main event, the 1958 Jim Meiden 500. Nobody seems to really know who Jim Meiden is. It wasn't really clear in the newspapers at the time, and reports since, even on NASCAR's own website, seemed confused as to who he actually was. But the race marked the 31st event of the 51 race schedule that year, and one of just 2 times the Cup Series has ever come north of the border. In 1952, Buddy Schumann won a 17-car battle at a small dirt track called Stamford Park near Niagara Falls. But that's also kind of close enough to the United States border where it's kind of easy to forget that was a Canadian event. By 1958, though, NASCAR had started to establish itself as a premier racing organization, so getting a race back then was a big deal. Skipping to 1958, the track, better known as Toronto Speedway, was a third of a mile oval on the Exhibition Place grounds, the same location of the current road track. Specifically, the track was held right around where the BML field is today, home of the Toronto Argonauts and Toronto FC. That's kind of somewhere in the infield between Turn 5 and Turn 9 and 10 today, but better known as Exhibition Stadium back then. Races would take place for a couple of decades, with the paved oval eventually forming in 1952. Early races would attract around 20,000 fans per event, and even local radio stations would cover races live. There wasn't much competition for Toronto sports during the 1950s, especially in the summer, so sports writers gave special attention to events that we consider minor to this day. Could you imagine late model races at Sunset Speedway getting national attention in the Toronto Star? That's not going to happen. NASCAR Pinty Series doesn't even get that attention, other than just some mentions occasionally. Eventually, NASCAR drivers were invited to take over in 1958, marking a historic event in auto racing in Canada. According to local newspaper reports, around 10,000 spectators packed the stands at the small venue on July 18, 1958, designed to look and race like the famous Bowman Gray Stadium that still operates and produces crash-filled events to this very year in North Carolina. It started off with 3 heat races for the 19-driver field made up purely of American drivers. The field had Lee Petty, Cotton Owens, Jim Reed, Shorty Rollins, and Rex White, among others. But what people didn't know they were witnessing was the start of a legendary career, and the reason why this race is so notable. The world was introduced to the driving styles of the king, 7-time NASCAR champion Richard Petty. At 21, he was the youngest driver in the field, piloting the number 142 Oldsmobile. He started the race in 7th, but was bumped out of the field on just lap 55 when Lee Petty, his own father, spun him out. Imagine that. It's your first top-level race, and you're known as a talented up-and-coming driver, and your own dad takes you out after becoming impatient. That he finished 17th in that race, but I think it's okay to say that the King had a pretty good career with 200 victories, and, for a while, the most championships in NASCAR history. Rex White led the first 71 laps of that race, but Lee Petty led the final 28 laps and never looked back. It was Lee Petty's 5th victory of the season, and at the time, there were very few drivers who can keep up with him on a weekly basis. That's part of the reason why racing back then was kind of a tricky subject, because you had a lot of guys who had some factory support and the big money, kind of like you see today, that were going out there and dominating the little small guys. Lee won $575 for his trouble, with the race holding a purse of just $4,200. The event wasn't well received. In fact, in the Toronto Star column of the event, the Cup race had just a single paragraph compared to the 10 for the local short trackers. In John McDonald's article, he referred to the event as the supposed highlight of the race card, adding that the spectators, enthusiastic about the regular stock car races, seemed bored by the late model cars run by NASCAR's best. Could it be because there was a fight in an early heat race that the local drivers provided more entertainment than the caution-free Cup Series event? Perhaps, but it marked the final time the series raced in Toronto, with the top division never returning to Canada again. But after the NASCAR event, plans started to get more complicated for the future of racing at the CNE. Late in 1858, the Toronto Argonauts football team signed a deal to use the infield space as a playing surface for 1959. Let's keep in mind that while this would eventually become a much bigger stadium, at the time, the track was the biggest portion of it, but the grandstands was huge. The grandstands held major events like pageants and even welcomed the Queen one time, so that was a very valuable space in a time where major sports stadiums weren't a thing really in Toronto. The track required some extra adjustments to meet the accommodations, most notably decreasing the size of the track to 28 feet wide. The drivers struggled to adjust the narrower surface, with reports of widespread crashes plaguing the events the following season. The turns were widened by 2 feet later on to help combat the concern, and for the most part it worked. In 1960, though, the track was finally given permission to race on Sundays, much to the delight of the organizers that tried for many years. Over the next few years, the track continued to see a variety of new events, with the series hosting major sprint, hobby, and midget events often. In 1964, the super modifieds that dominated the track for over a decade were replaced with a stout late model series. It also played host to the USAC Midgets, which hosted the Toronto 500 on a couple of occasions. In fact, Mario Andretti actually failed to make the main field for the event in 1965, so the competition was that good. It also didn't help that the series never returned after that point. Maybe Mario Andretti was mad. Kidding, obviously, he didn't have that power at that point. But as the years went on, race dates continued to drop, and fans could start to see the beginning of the end. The oval at the CNE would remain open until 1966, when it was announced that the area of the speedway is to be replaced with a track and field course. There was some hope that the cars could run at the Coliseum just near where the track was located, but nothing came out of it. All of a sudden, racing at the CNE was over. Until the 1980s, that was. In the late 1980s, with the Toronto Blue Jays and Toronto Argonauts now taking control of Exhibition Stadium, there was talk of bringing racing back to the 17,000-seat facility. The city of Toronto helped make it happen, and nearly $1 million later, the facility welcomed back stock cars for the 1990 season. Weekly racing included the CASCAR Late Model Series, the return of midget and hobby stock racing, and even endurance events, monster truck shows, and demolition derbies. Two mainstreams in NASCAR Pinty Series today, Kerry Mix and Mark Dilley, were among the competitors that raced in the late model series, with Randy Latour taking the title. I wasn't around to see races back then, but many fans took a liking to the track. But that wasn't enough to save the rebirth of the facility, unfortunately. Advertising was scarce, with many events failing to host even 1,000 fans. There was still hope that racing could return in 1991 and 1992 as originally planned, but local fans started to complain, mainly because of the noise, which was understandable given the fact it was close to some neighborhoods and increased traffic in the area didn't help. Back then, the TTC wasn't as advanced as it was today, and that made things kind of tougher for fans wanting to get to the track, meaning they would need to drive, which, again, more traffic didn't help. In early 1991, after watching the track lose money due to poor attendance, the City of Toronto pulled the plug on what could have been a successful return of amateur racing to Canada's largest city. There was an attempt to bring back racing in 1997, but to little interest. There's next to no information about the return, and even die-hard Canadian racing fans forgot it happened. At that point, stock car racing in the big city was dead, until CASCAR returned to the current IndyCar track in the 1990s. In each July, the parking lots and local roadways around the grounds are populated by IndyCar, but in recent years, the NASCAR Pinty Series has been a highlight of the show card of close quarters action and victories from some of the country's top drivers, including Alex Tagliani, Kevin Lacroix, and Andrew Ranger. It's been a hot topic for debate. Could NASCAR's Cup Series actually race on a street course? There's some heavy logistical concerns of spacing, both in the garage and on track, but I'd love to see it, just not at the expense of the Honda Indy. I know the races have kind of struggled the last couple years, especially with the most recent redesign of the front straightaway, but I gotta say, there's a lot of history in that event, and it means a lot to this city. The Exhibition Stadium will forever be remembered as the original home of the Toronto Blue Jays before the MLB club moved downtown to the much bigger Rogers Centre. But it's great to think that NASCAR and stock car racing in general had such an important impact on the early days of sporting events on the CNE grounds. For CanRace, I'm Stephen Ellis. Thanks for watching.